This evening we interrupt the showing of Barbados' Sea Portal to celebrate the season of emancipation. Hello and welcome to an act of great courage. I'm Sherwood McCaskey, thanks for your time. It was on Thursday, March the 28th, 1985, that Barbadians joined then Prime Minister Bernard St. John, now the late Sir Harold Bernard St. John, and an assembled company right here for the unveiling of a statue in the likeness of an enslaved freedom fighter. Officially known as the Statue of Emancipation, it stands tall as if he were looking towards the heavens in a shout of praise as a sign of celebration of his freedom. Exactly why was this enslaved man held in such high esteem? And why 13 years after his unveiling here would thousands of Barbadians assemble on Bay Street to be part of that special moment when he is officially proclaimed as a national hero of Barbados and accorded the highest title, the Right Excellent. In celebration of the season of emancipation, CBC TV 8 presents this, the first program in the series, An Act of Great Courage. The program begins right here on the Bailey's Plantation in St. Philip.
Sunday, the 14th of April 2019, will be the 203rd anniversary of the Bussa Rebellion. And in my opinion, if there is one anniversary, one historical anniversary that we Barbadians should always be celebrating, it is the anniversary of the Bussa Rebellion.
I think I would want to go along with the now accepted position that it has to be seen as a rebellion in terms of its intentions and in terms of its achievements.
This is not where you expect a revolution, but this is the place where the most effective revolution was planned, right in the center of this complex. So that makes it really the mother of all the slave revolutions of that time.
It is at the very root of our nationhood, because you could not be a nation if 80% or more of your people were in a state of enslavement and regarded within the law as less than human beings. So to the extent that Barbados is a nation today, critical to that process of nationhood was the process that led to the abolition of slavery. And historically, the abolition of slavery was basically brought about by the unceasing antagonism and resistance of the enslaved to that system.
Now, the major outward act of resistance occurred in 1816. While records were kept and some writing was done, the majority of the population in Barbados generally became aware of the central figure in the rebellion sometime in the 1970s. It was after well-known Barbadian Elambe Motley established the Bussa Awards. Many Barbadians for the first time asked the question, who was Bussa and what was his importance to Barbados?
Now, the early 70s introduced now Barbadian writing, and the two major persons would have been the late Alexander Hoyas, a man I respect but different in terms of his historiography, and a guy that I have utmost respect for because he taught me history at KFL, Charles Watson. His doctorate was Barbados' Civilized Isle, etc. And of course, he ends that by looking at the revolt. And he is also adopting the position, both he and Hoyas, that the revolution was conceived and planned by Joseph Pitt, Washington Franklin. They did not miss out Bussa, but they did not give him prominence. Hoyas went further and said that Bussa was an African born in Africa. He did not show any source of where he got that information. So one of my first jobs was to see if I could find a Bussa.
Now, did he say Bussa? Yes, you've heard correctly. As a historian and researcher, Bobby Morris took this job seriously. And for a number of years, he was a regular user of the Department of Archives and the museum. There he spent countless hours leafing through the many papers, registers and reports of that period. Now, you might wish to ask, how did Basso become Bassa?
The way how Barbadians speak, how they pronounce things, can sometimes change a name. So that in the common parlance, Bassa, not Basso. So after time, people thought that the man's name was Bassa. But all the records that I have seen, the former records, he is B-U-S-S-O. And sometimes I see a Basso, which is B-U-S-S-O-E. But the Basso that we're talking about on the list of plantation names, B-U-S-S-O. That's his name. And I'm sure Hillary knows that. He knows that it is B-U-S-S-O. But what he's probably saying is that that's the common name he was known by, B-U-S-S-A. So let's leave it at that.
Well, we all understand that this special naming convention has now become a part of the Caribbean culture.
I know he's Basso for sure in terms of the records, B-U-S-S-O. And you go through not only there, there were so many Bassos in Barbados, also the plantations of Bassos. I went to so many plantations, I found Basso. I found several plantations in Nannyquigs. A lot of these names were common names because, first of all, in the African naming system, a good article has been done by Professor Pedro. So you have the names of the week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and so on. So each one of them had an African name, you know. So you hear somebody called Kwame or Koba or Kamina. It was the day on which they were born. So that was one of the ways how a lot of Africans were named on the day when they were born. So you would know if a man born on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday, based on the name they gave him as their first name. But another thing was where you came from. So if you came from Bassa, a lot of the people were called Bassa. And there was no second name, you know, Bassa. On the 1806 list, there is Bassa and Little Bassa. I can only assume that it means Basso Shire, Basso and Little Basso. You see, again, but to follow through, then I go back on the list, of course, now, after the 1870 list, Basso ain't no more because he's dead.
Let us talk more about the research process and what was done to find the name Basso. And yes, he was identified right here on the Bailey's plantation.
First of all, I started looking at the estates owned by Reverend Alexander Scott. And I went into the history before Scott got them, hoping that I would find a list, because sometimes you have to do an inventory of your estate and you have to give the names of all your slaves. 10 years before the actual revolt, I find this list. And Basso's name is on the list, number 3 or number 4 on the list. Unfortunately, that list does not look at whether you're African or Creole, nor does it look at your age or anything like that. All that came after about when the Slave Registry Act was passed. And then to make sure that new slaves were not coming in, you had to put the names of the slaves on the plantation. You had to look at their age and where they were born and those sorts of things. Here I'm finding Basso in history now. As far as I know, the first person to identify Basso, that Basso, on the plantation 10 years before the revolt. I thought that was significant. So I said, if he's there, let me go and see if I can find out. So looking at deeds and all the plantations, and I'm finding all these Bassos. 1759, 1784, Bassos on the plantations.
His concreteness began to emerge within the next 2 generations. And it was on the 60th anniversary of the rebellion, in what the colonial historians call the Confederate or the Confederate riot of 1876. the exact 60th anniversary of the Bussa Rebellion, the same week, the same days, exact 60th anniversary, that the black people in Barbados go up in revolution again. Exact days on the 60th anniversary. What is important about that is that by this time, and this is now 30 years after emancipation. So 30 years after emancipation, black people now have their own newspaper, the Times. So now, for the first time, black people have a voice where they could write and say in the press. They now own their own press. And the Times was their newspaper. And that is where we hear for the first time, when the editor of the Times, reflecting on the history of black politics in Barbados, interviewed the people who were still alive and who were participants in the Bussa Rebellion and who survived it, both black and white. And in that editorial in the Times, where the editor says that Barbados has not seen this level of warfare since the days of General Bussa. And then we hear for the first time the name and the title, written in an editorial, a man by the name of General Bussa, and describing what General Bussa did, how he went about it. And in other parts of the newspaper, there is testimony to the mistakes that were made in the time of General Bussa that were not going to be made now. Because now they're saying, now we have muskets, we have all the latest military technology, we have the guns, and we know how to use them. But in the newspaper, the rebels were saying that in the day of General Bussa, too many of the rebels were not equipped to handle the military technology. So a lot of these comparisons are now being made between 1816 and 1876, and the testimony now exists in our newspaper. Now, so you can now contrast what the black people were writing in their newspaper about their own people, their own history, and their community, and compare that with what the white community was saying about what happened. And what you have are two very different views of this revolution. One that says major attempt to destroy this culture of slavery and to replace it with black freedom and black justice. And then you have another view that says it was a small skirmish, an isolated event in a parish, easily crushed, let's forget it and move on. We now have to decide how to interpret this past and pull the narrative together to answer the questions.
When we think of that resistance, we think of the successful Haitian Revolution. But we also think of those three major 19th century slave rebellions in the British Caribbean, the slave rebellions in Barbados, Guyana, and Jamaica. But the first of those three was the 1816 Bussa Rebellion. You know, then that led on to 1823 in Guyana, 1831 in Jamaica. But in a sense, symbolically, the 1816 Bussa Rebellion may well have been the most important, simply because in 1816, Barbados was seen as the bastion of British colonial power, the bastion of the slavery system. The Bussa Rebellion constituted the first time in which the enslaved African Barbadians were able to come together as one unit and to be a people in every sense of the word.
There were many other attempts at this form of outward resistance prior to 1816, but they failed. Why did they fail?
Virtually all of them had been sold out by some slave informant. there had always been an element of disunity. If we go back and we read Ligon's History of Barbados, he tells us about the first attempt, 1649. In fact, 1649 is a very important year because in that year you had both an attempted rebellion of the white indentured servants and an attempted rebellion of the enslaved Africans. Both of them were sold out. Both of them were sold out by informants among the oppressed class. So we begin in 1649 and we don't have that unity. We don't have that seamless unity to carry forward the plans to successful rebellion. And there's a cost to pay for that because after it is sold out, people are executed. You know, there is a severe penalty to be paid for resisting oppression and failing in that resistance. Your life is lost.
And this was the reality of all those ancestors who carried out the ultimate act of resistance, that is, outright rebellion. They knew that they were taking their lives in their hands, so to speak, and subjecting themselves to the most horrible form of death.
I mean, people are burnt alive, people are mutilated, their bodies are drawn and quartered, you know, their heads are cut off. So this is the fate that is there for you if you carry out that rebellion and you fail. So 1649, the first one, sold out. We don't have that unity. 1675, the second one. This is the so-called Coromantee rebellion. Again, it is sold out by a house, a so-called house negress, Anna, alias Fortunia, a domestic slave of a Judge Hall. She sells it out. And once again, scores of our ancestors are executed. 1683, 1686, all of these are discovered. 1692, another major conspiracy. Ultimately, some of the conspirators, Hammond and Ben, under torture and threat of execution, they sell it out. And they reveal the names of all the other conspirators. Many, many are executed, are put to death. 1701, again, it is discovered, it is sold out.
So between the period of 1649 and 1701, there were 6 attempts, and they all failed because our ancestors did not have the required unity so important for the success of such revolts.
The plantocracy in Barbados was so superior and so arrogant that they boasted that there had not even been an attempt at rebellion in Barbados for over 100 years, the last one being in 1701.
We are so satisfied that our enslaved Africans are compliant with their enslavement. We are so satisfied that after 100 years, there had been no rebellions on this island for 100 years. And the 18th century, that long 18th century, was the period that had shown the greatest number of rebellions across the Caribbean were taking place in the 18th century, with the crescendo in the Haitian Revolution. But in that 18th century and the crescendo, there had been no rebellions at headquarters, which is Barbados. So because it's the showpiece of stability, of control, of management of African peoples, the slave owners' response to that was to give the Africans even more social concessions. So the Africans in Barbados had more social concessions, weekend parties, a pass system, a ticket system to travel from parish to parish. They show your ticket and you could move from parish to parish. And the enslavers had created this system of flexibility in return for no rebellion. So one can argue that there was almost a kind of deal that seemed to have been made where we will retreat from revolution, but in return for that, you need to normalize as much as possible our lives. Allow us to move around the island, allow us to have social events, cultural events. Importantly, allow us to have domestic arrangements where we could get married and we could keep our children in the household with us. So you stabilize the African culture by allowing people to create these domestic unions, and you respect to them. You don't sell the children on a regular basis and so on. And we have all of that information. So in a sense then, one could argue that the revolution, when it finally came, was a gradual process of effective planning to disrupt and to destroy that entire arrangement that the white community had become comfortable with. And we have their records. We have the statement from Colonel Hinds, who actually said, he said, if I had 10,000 pounds, I would have gone to bed with the money exposed. So comfortable I was that there would be no eruption of our enslaved Africans. So there was this sense of comfort.
So they felt that they had so consolidated this classic slave society. Hilary Beckles says the first slave society in the history of the world, the first society founded totally on slavery. They felt that they had so consolidated this social system that it would last for centuries.
It was that well-constructed slave society that would ultimately lead to the rebellion. Exactly what was a slave society and what was it founded on?
1816, Barbados is the oldest of the slave societies in the Caribbean. And we make a distinction between societies with enslaved people and societies that are entirely dependent for their sustainability on the economics of slavery. In other words, there were societies with enslaved African peoples 100 years before Barbados came on board in 1627. But Barbados emerged as the first society that was entirely dependent upon enslaved Africans to survive. And critically, Barbados becomes the first society in the Caribbean, indeed in the Americas, where African peoples were the majority. So from around the 1660s, African people are the majority in Barbados. And that continues right down to the Buster Rebellion in 1816. So Barbados is a matured society based on slavery. It is the society with the largest ratios, that is African majority, the first to achieve that status. And Barbados is seen as the center of slavery in the Caribbean. It is the place where the model of enslavement was perfected. It was seen as the model to be emulated by other colonies. It was seen, therefore, ideologically as the headquarters of slavery. Barbados then was unique in so many different ways, but it was the place where the model of bringing African peoples across an ocean, enslaving them on sugar plantation, and making a great profit. That was the purpose of the whole thing, to make a great profit. Barbados was the place where that financial model was proven to be very successful. So in that sense, therefore, it is seen as the society that is the showpiece in the new world of enslavement. So the Buster Rebellion of 1816 comes against the background of those developments.
one of the chief architects of the system, the most refined and developed system of slavery that was perfected right here in Barbados by people like Sir James Drax at the Drax Hall plantation in the mid-17th century. This was something new in early capitalism. They experimented and perfected a system of exploitation of labor based on slavery, a system for the super exploitation of labor to produce super abundant profits. And it was perfected right here in Barbados.
I have described Barbados not only as the center of the culture of enslavement, the ideological home, so to speak, the heartbeat of enslavement across the Americas, not only in the Caribbean, but north through South Carolina, where Barbadians had expanded and carried the slave culture. They had carried it to Jamaica in the 1660s. They carried it to South Carolina in the 1670s. So Barbados is an exporter of the slavery brand. So across the hemisphere, the word was out that Barbados is the place where you must visit if you really want to see how slavery works. If you really want to see how the economics of slavery could be put into action, the management of enslaved peoples, if you really want to see a colony effectively governed by a small minority of people, if you want to see that and if you want to emulate it, go to Barbados and see the showpiece in action.
Those plantations are concentration camps.
And on that note, here's where we end this week's program and make our way from this parish. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. Do join us next week at the same time as we return to this parish and continue celebrations of the season of emancipation with this, an act of great courage.